In the late 19th century, the whole world started to take an interest in the North and South Poles, and dozens of exploratory missions set out from all around the globe. They aimed to begin exploring parts of the North Pole, and indeed, they mapped many of its regions. Although Norway was at the forefront of these nations, being in the northern part of the world, Sweden was right next door. Its attempts in the matter were very few, and most of the missions they undertook to the North Pole were unsuccessful. While the Swedish government itself was not very interested in the subject, a determined individual emerged who was insistent that his country become one of the participants in these missions. His name was Solomon August Andrei, but Andrei had a slightly different idea. The mission he wanted to undertake would not be land or sea-based like others. It would be via balloon, but what was not known at the time was that this distinctive journey would turn into one of the most mysterious incidents in the history of North Pole explorations. Welcome and come, let me tell you today about Andrei's balloon expedition to the North Pole. But before we begin, don't forget to subscribe and activate the bell so that you receive a notification for the new story every week. And I want you to get this video to 2,000 likes before the next video. Are you with me? Andrei was born on October 18, 1854, and from the very day of his birth, he consistently and sincerely considered the balloon a remarkable and brilliant invention. This particular matter greatly fueled a strong passion within him for anything related to mechanics and physics. So, in the year 1870, at the young age of only 16, he made the decision to study at the esteemed Royal Institute of Technology in Sweden. After 4 years, he graduated with high honors in mechanical engineering. And this study was an additional reason for his increased involvement with air balloons. Because only 2 years after graduating from the institute, Andrei traveled to the United States to attend the Centennial exhibition there. He took advantage of the opportunity and worked as a guard in the Swedish pavilion at the exhibition, and this job gave him the chance to meet him. John Wise was one of the famous balloon pioneers of his era, and indeed, Andrei began to get close to him and learn everything about balloons. But luck wasn't on his side. The exhibition period ended and he had to return to Sweden once again before he could take everything he wanted from John Wise. When Andrei returned to Sweden, he decided to open a workshop to work in, but his project did not prosper and the workshop was closed. He returned to the university where he was studying and worked there as a teaching assistant, and after only 2 years, he was appointed as one of the officials, collecting data for a scientific expedition to the Svalbard archipelago in 1882, with 11 countries participating in the mission. And Andrei was the engineer representing Sweden in this expedition, through which he was able to demonstrate his capabilities. This was because Sweden's results were the most accurate among all participating countries, and this research was the reason Andrei gained the recognition in the scientific community. Step by step, Andrei began planning to embark on an exploratory journey to the North Pole himself and to convince a journalist working for the Stockholm newspaper. By contributing a large sum of money towards purchasing a colorful helium balloon, Andrei was finally able to buy the very balloon he had been dreaming of owning his entire life. And then they named it Esafia. When Andrei first bought the balloon, he treated it exactly like a young boy who had bought the bike he had always longed for, and he immediately began working on the region. He studied it in the field of mechanics in hopes of making a breakthrough in aviation. The plan was to replace the hot air used to operate the balloon with hydrogen, and indeed Andrei succeeded in his plan. And he embarked on 9 extraordinary journeys, traveling. Although the balloon was strong and successfully endured flying the entire 1500 kilometers distance, it always faced a persistent problem during each flight. That was the difficulty of controlling it, to the extent that on one of the flights Andrei completely lost control of the balloon. It descended from the Baltic Sea until it reached the shores of Finland, and what happened made him think of tying ropes underneath the balloon, so that it would balance its weight and bring it closer to the ground, thus reducing its speed, allowing for better control. Although it wasn't a strong scientific solution, it did achieve the desired effect, and the balloons began to travel at a slower speed and control. Translated by Nancy Kankar. In the late 19th century, the Norwegian government, which had made significant efforts in exploration, debated with the Swedish government about not wanting to just watch and take any action, and this discussion made the Swedish government begin to seriously consider participating. And this was a golden opportunity coming to Andrea on a golden platter for him to seize it and tell the government that he is the right man for this mission. Indeed, he participated in a conference of the Royal Academy and presented his idea at the conference, an unprecedented exploratory journey to the North Pole. A journey by hydrogen balloon, and he clarified at the conference that the hydrogen balloon, despite its efficiency, however, he is too young to carry equipment and supplies for such a long trip, so he told them that he has already started producing it. He will again launch in France with the help of specialists, ensuring all the appropriate specifications for the journey, and by the end of his speech, a large number of people attended the conference. They were truly convinced by the idea, and despite the fact that his project would cost at the time 13,000 kronor, which is over $1 million. However, he served an award from the Royal Academy, and amid the excitement and enthusiasm caused by Andreas' promises to them, King Carl XI's son Gustav of Sweden generously donated 30,000 kronor from his own personal funds. Despite the significant support Andrei received locally, his project, when it spread throughout the entire scientific community, experts from around the globe began closely scrutinizing the plan and pointed out its flaws. Because even though Andrea is the leading balloon expert in all of Sweden, there are many experts around the world who are older and more skilled in the field. The problem is that most of them criticized his project, and some even stated that the plan Andrea wants to implement is impossible to succeed in any way. Nevertheless, Andrea continued his agreement with the French company, which will construct it at a height of about 30 meters. And its diameter is 21 meters, and it is designed to carry a giant basket in which a bed, provisions, and scientific equipment will be placed. The robust system is capable of carrying more than 2.5 tons, and based on the manufacturer's claims, it will be able to fly continuously for 30 days without interruption. But while working on it, it became clear that these capabilities were somewhat exaggerated because the balloon leaks gas at a slight rate despite that. Andrei designed it to carry the balloon and named it the Eagle balloon. In 1896, after more than a year of planning, Andrei finally decided that the time had come to choose the team that he would share this great achievement with, and among a large group of applicants, Andrei chose two to accompany him on the trip: Niels Ekholm and Niels Strindberg. Ekholm was an expert in meteorology and was originally Andrei's leader in the mission that departed to the cold regions a few years ago. As for Strindberg, he was an outstanding student, renowned for pioneering research in the fields of physics and chemistry. Not to mention that he was the inventor of a weather-resistant camera, which is the camera they took with them on this trip, and although each of the three had a specific skill, but their skills were in the scientific aspect, not in exploration. But that wasn't a very important point for Andrei. Because based on his calculations, he expected the trip to be smooth, simple, and without any fatigue, and everyone was impressed by the comforts that the platform would be equipped with, which was supposed to make this mission a journey rather than an exploratory mission. But despite that, Ekholm was still not at ease at all. The outrageous figure that this area was supposed to provide hadn't crossed Ekholm's mind, so he decided to conduct some tests himself before the trip. And unfortunately, his suspicion was justified. The platform was leaking a large portion of gas to the extent that the lifting power of the platform would decrease daily by an amount ranging from 41 kilograms to 68 kilograms. And based on this leakage rate, the platform could operate for a duration ranging from 15 to 17 days at most, and it is impossible to reach 30 days as the company claimed. This means that not only would they be unable to explore the North Pole, but they likely wouldn't make it there. In addition to the technical problems we discovered, in this area, over the past few months, they have been on Dens Island located in the Fallet archipelago, which was supposed to be the starting point of the journey. They discovered something extremely dangerous. The winds blowing into the area were coming from the north. And this was contrary to what Andrei had expected, because the whole plan was based on the winds coming from the south. As a result, the entire plan was thoroughly ruined, while the national press, other media outlets, and the engaged Swedish public were diligently following their brothers. They subscribed to the channel when Andrei and Atraf announced that there were errors in the calculations and the trip would be cancelled. After the decision to cancel the trip, Andrei decided to postpone the trip by just 1 year. But when they returned from Dens Island, one of the engineers responsible for Mecca, Ekholm, reported that he saw Andreas more than once withdrawing during breaks and filling the balloon with gas so that no one would know the true leak rates. And of course, after what Ekholm discovered himself during the tests, it was natural for him to believe what he was told. and he became convinced that Andrei was indeed deceiving them and ready to put all their lives at risk, which is why the head of Swedish transport authorities, Ekholm, told Andrei that he would not continue with this project unless they used another balloon besides the asset balloon. But making such a decision was very difficult for Andrei after the costs incurred by the balloon and his name becoming renowned in the scientific community. Indeed, Andrei was unsure of what to do. Until we eventually reached the vibrant spring of 1897, when the esteemed Alfred Nobel arrived and decided to wholeheartedly support the project with a substantial sum of money. And enthusiasm surged in Andrei's veins once again, and he decided to dismiss Ekholm and bring in another in his place. The choice fell on civil engineer, not Frankel, to replace Ekholm in assuming his meteorological duties effectively and seamlessly. After the team arrived at Dens Island in early July 1897, they were all optimistic that the intended journey would not disappoint them. More importantly, Andrei's calculations this time regarding the winds and their speed were accurate, unlike last time, and on July 11th. Andrei firmly commanded his dedicated crew to release the sturdy ropes and then expertly launched the majestic Eagle balloon gracefully into the expansive sky, directing it toward the northern polar villages. However, not even a few minutes after takeoff had occurred, and right in front of the eyes of all the journalists who were intently witnessing this crucial moment, the balloon began to lose its balance frighteningly due to the heavy load and couldn't rise above sea level except for a little rainfall. Before Andrei and his companions could think of a solution, strong winds blew over them, dragging the balloon into the middle of the ocean. And the basket that carried the crew with their equipment started hitting the water's surface, turning feelings of excitement and joy into widespread fear and panic. After what happened, Andriusamello had no choice but one of two options. Either they sacrifice part of their provisions and equipment, or they sink. And indeed, they decided to dispose of the sandbags they had and any equipment they could throw away, and they kept throwing items from the basket. It was not until they lightened the balloon's load by 770 kilograms that they, with the reduced weight, were finally able to endure the strong and turbulent waves. And they rose slightly above the sea surface. The problem now was that this slight ascent was too much, to the extent that they rose beyond the allowable limit. This means that the air pressure in the system will become lower than expected, and as a result, more hydrogen leakage will occur. And in the first few hours, when the situation had somewhat stabilized, Andrei wrote 2 messages explaining what happened. And he threw them from the balloon onto the water's surface, hoping someone would reach the shore and hear about them. Exactly 10 hours after stabilizing in the atmosphere, the hydrogen supply began to gradually decrease. And the balloon slowly began to descend again, gradually lowering its altitude until it finally reached the sea surface once more, thereby marking a total of 42 hours away. Literally facing strong winds and repeated storms, while massive waves crash against them every so often regularly, to the extent that they spent 2 whole days without getting any sleep and had to do without another large portion of the equipment and provisions they had to lighten the balloon's load, and what exacerbated the problem further was the waves crashing against the basket. And the water drops accumulating on the balloon created a thick layer of ice on its surface, increasing the load more than before. Therefore, it was both natural and ultimately inevitable that, following all these numerous disasters, the final outcome would be the balloon's eventual falling. It was only 2 days after takeoff. On July 13, 1897, the balloon finally touched down gently on the ground after its entire supply of hydrogen had been completely exhausted. They made their home in an exceptionally isolated area surrounded by ice, located 800 kilometers to the north of Svalbard. But fortunately, their landing was gradual rather than abrupt, which ensured that their touchdown on the ground wasn't severe or jarring, and as a result, none of the 3 of them sustained any injuries. And the equipment and provisions they still had remained intact as they were, and although anyone in their situation should have been scared, anxious and tense. However, they were reassured and hopeful that someone would come to rescue them after everyone saw what happened to them in the first few minutes of takeoff, which was clear evidence that this flight would not end successfully, and to further confirm that they needed assistance and that the situation was dire, they sent 4 messages with carrier pigeons. It was among the items they took with them on the balloon, but unfortunately, none of these messages made it to land. There was only 1 message out of the 4 that the pigeon was carrying. It landed after a while on the deck of a fishing boat in the Baltic Sea. But unfortunately, when the message was seen, it was already too late. After Andrei sent the messages, he and his colleague began gathering the equipment that was on the balloon and set up a tent to shelter in until help arrived. But unfortunately, after a day or two, a whole week passed without any help coming to them, and at that time, they decided to make a plan. To organize the food they had so that it would last as long as possible, and they began to plan how they would get out of this crisis. Since the place they were in was completely isolated from anywhere, they thought the best choice for them was to go to any of the shelters that were built by the missions that had previously passed through before them, and then hide there until help finally arrived. The map they had indicated that the nearest shelter they could reach was located in the southwest on an island in the far north of Svalbard. But there is another shelter in the southeast with more supplies than the one in the west, so they decided to go to the shelter located in the southeast. But unfortunately, what they didn't know was that all the maps they had were completely wrong. On July 22nd, the three of them loaded 180 kilograms of supplies onto their sleds and set off from their location. We are currently heading towards the shelter located in the southeast region, which based on their maps was approximately 700 kilometers away. They would of course traverse it on foot and sleds, but there wasn't much time left from the start of their journey. They discovered that moving with their sleds loaded with all this weight was extremely difficult, especially since the snow they were traversing was uneven. There were hours when they fell into cracks in the ice and all the supplies were getting into the water, forcing them to stop and retrieve them again. Not to mention the bumps and ledges they fell off from, constantly having to collect all the supplies from the snow. All of this, of course, in addition to the psychological stress and physical exhaustion, not to mention they were all suffering from temporary blindness. Because daylight was brilliantly reflecting on the pure white snow, especially since during this particular period the day lasted for 24 hours. This situation implies that not a single night was passing for them, and this persisted for a whole week. The suffering forced them to get rid of a large part of the food supplies they had in order to reduce the weight a bit. This means that from that moment on, they were forced to search along their path for anyone's food to eat, and despite their attempts, they traveled with all their strength to reach their destination, while enduring the journey over the course of 2 full weeks. They covered a distance of 96 kilometers from one end to the other, and in early August they became convinced that there was no hope that they could reach their destination. At this stage, the only option left was to change direction and go to the second shelter located in the southwest. Because, according to the map they had, it was much closer, and based on their calculations, they would need to walk for 2 months to reach it. But since this period was the onset of summer and the high temperatures would engulf parts of Al-Tahrir, they were able to use a small boat they had with them, which significantly shortened part of the route, but still required additional effort. This did not prevent the journey from being extremely difficult, with threats like tank attacks, bombing of food supplies, and things they were not prepared to handle. By mid-September, their hope to reach the shelter began to collapse. Time was starting to wear them down, and they were not covering the distance they had planned on covering. And this means they won't be able to arrive on time, and if September passes, winter will start to set in. The water will freeze once more, and as a result, they won't be able to move the boat. The only solution they thought of at that time was to remain securely on top of a giant ice floe. They drifted on the water's surface, letting it carry them to Marsa Matruh, because the wind speed was high and the large ice floe was moving quickly. I think Andrea believed that if they kept drifting south at this speed, there was a strong chance they'd encounter a fishing boat before winter set in on them. But what they hadn't accounted for was that in October, the ice floe they were on would split, and at that moment they feared they couldn't continue their journey. They eventually reached a nearby island and built a small, cozy cabin, where they happily stayed together until they carefully decided what to do next. Despite the exhaustion and fatigue that Andrea and his 2 companions endured during their challenging journey, their morale remained high up to that moment, and they still maintained great hope. To the extent that every morning they would leave the cabin to photograph their surroundings with the camera they had, as if they were on a luxury trip, not lost in the middle of nowhere. Andrea and Strindberg began to write journals. They detailed everything that happened to them from the start of the journey, and Strindberg was also writing a letter to his fiancée, hoping he would return to her soon. And you see them, but the strange thing is that, in a mysterious and sudden way, Strindberg's writings stopped on October 7th. And the day after, Andrei's writings also ceased, but the strange thing was that what they had written did not indicate that they were facing any problems. On the contrary, they said they were settled in a solid location, that they could still endure the winter weather, and they hoped that by spring someone would come to rescue them. But unfortunately, those were the last words they wrote before the living beings parted, leaving behind a mystery that lasted for a full 3 decades. Thank you. On the other hand, from the moment the journey began, everyone present was sure that Andrei's companion would encounter problems during the long journey, and that they wouldn't be able to reach, and because of that, many search operations were actually launched after them via land. But every rescue operation that was launched kept searching for a period without finding anything, and eventually returned, and one by one, interest began to wane. Until people completely lost hope of finding them, and as the disappearance continued, everyone became convinced that the three, they had died until one day in August 1930, when by pure chance a Norwegian expedition in the Arctic archipelago discovered them. During my expedition, I saw an abandoned rowing boat inscribed with Andrei Polar Expedition, and the immediate rescue operations were launched for it. The search surrounded the entire area until they found the cabin they were staying in, and their skeletal structure was present inside and beside them, their personal diaries, scientific journals, and the equipment they had in the world. Over the years, many scientists, doctors, and historians have tried to examine the remnants they left behind in the cabin, specifically the diaries they found, considering them as the only evidence from which we could arrive at what exactly happened. The theory that was popular at first accused the indigenous people of attacking them, but of course this theory was refuted when they found the supplies and equipment. And remnants of the food cans are still present as they were, not stolen, and at that time another theory emerged, suggesting that the cause of their death was the food they were eating. In their notes, it was written that they ate large quantities of seal and polar bear meat, and the doctors then said it is possible they were infected with trichinosis. But also, trichinosis was rare when it caused death, and because of that, another theory emerged saying that the cause of their death was lead poisoning, due to the canned foods they were eating, or that they contracted scurvy due to a deficiency in vitamin C, especially since from September 10th. That is, about a month before the last date they wrote, Andrei's writings were sporadic and his plan was shaky to the point that his village was already difficult. Forward's condition could have been the result of poisoning symptoms or an illness that he was unaware of, but others came forward and said it was perfectly normal and might have been what disrupted his writing. Due to the extreme cold and loss of sensation in their limbs, they were unable to function. One of the most popular explanations for what happened to Andrei Zamilo is that they were suddenly attacked by a polar bear. As we know, Strindberg's memoirs stopped one day before Andreas. When they examined his body inside the cabin, they concluded that he was the first to die among them. They found the clothes he was wearing torn, and his body itself was wedged into the small crevice beside the cabin. From this, they inferred that a polar bear of significant size killed him. But his colleague tried to save him before the bear could consume him and took his story hidden inside the cave. They suspected that while his colleague was attempting to rescue him, Frankel was also injured and his clothes were torn, but he managed to escape. However, he died later due to blood loss. He was sitting inside the cabin, and Andrei remained alone on the island until he died, leaning against a rock with empty morphine containers beside him. It is clear that he died from an overdose because they found his memoirs wrapped inside his clothes for whoever found his body. He knows the entire story, but unfortunately he did not mention anything in the narrative about the cause of their deaths, leaving a mystery that still puzzles the whole world. Until today. And with that, we've reached the end of the story. I'm waiting for your opinions, and if you have a story you'd like us to share, write it in the comments. The idea that receives a lot of engagement, I'll do it, God willing. Show some support by subscribing, liking, commenting, and all that good work. Also, share the video with anyone you think would enjoy it. See you next time with an even more exciting story than dates. Goodbye.